History is a story, but it is an edited one. It is a grand narrative curated by the survivors, the conquerors, and the literate. They choose the heroes and the villains, the triumphs to be immortalized in stone, and the failures to be left to the wind and the dust. For every Rome, there are 100 cultures that left no chronicles. For every Athens, 1,000 societies whose voices were silenced before they ever learned to write. But silence is not absence. The past does not truly disappear. It merely sleeps. It waits patiently beneath desert sands, locked in the poled embrace of a peat bog, or encoded in the haunting, hollow eyes of a clay figure. And when it is disturbed, when a shovel strikes something that is not rock, the official story begins to unravel. The comfortable narrative we have built for ourselves starts to crack. We tell ourselves that progress is a straight line, that humanity has moved steadily from savagery to enlightenment. We look at the ruins of great empires and see only their grandeur, their mathematics, their art, their architecture. But this is a comforting illusion. Often, the very mortar that held these magnificent societies together was a substance we now find unthinkable: terror, ritualized cruelty, and blood. This is a journey into that uncomfortable truth. We are not exploring the celebrated halls of history, but its forgotten, soundproofed cellars. We will unearth 5 civilizations, lost or misunderstood, whose legacies are not just of pottery and pyramids, but of practices so sinister they were deliberately buried, not just by time, but by the cultures that followed them. These are societies that thrived on principles that defy our modern comprehension. They were masters of their worlds, sophisticated and complex. They built cities, commanded armies, and created art of breathtaking beauty. Yet, intertwined with this creativity was a capacity for methodical, systematic violence that was not an aberration, but a cornerstone of their existence. It was their religion, their law, and their politics, a constant, chilling hum beneath the surface of daily life. We will travel to the arid coasts of Peru, where the desert itself became a stage for ritual executions. We will stand on the edge of a mass grave filled with the smallest of victims, a sacrifice on a scale that stuns the modern conscience. We will venture into the mist-shrouded forests of ancient Europe, where the line between warrior and priest was blurred, and the human head was the ultimate currency of power. We will then cross continents to the plains of West Africa to confront a culture so mysterious its only voice is its art, and that art whispers of unsettling possibilities. And finally, we will journey to the heart of a well-known empire, only to find that the famous horrors we think we know are but the tip of a terrifying iceberg of institutionalized cruelty. These are not simple tales of primitive savagery. They are complex stories of faith, fear, and power. They force us to ask a disturbing question. Is the darkness we are about to uncover an anomaly of the ancient world? Or is it a fundamental, recurring chapter in the human story? The evidence suggests that for many of these lost peoples, civilization and barbarism were not opposites. They were two sides of the same blood-soaked coin. Our investigation begins in a place where it almost never rains, a sliver of land squeezed between the Andes Mountains and the Pacific Ocean. This is the northern coast of Peru, a landscape of stark, monochromatic beauty. Here, the sun beats down with an unforgiving intensity, and the sand shifts in whispering dunes that can swallow entire cities whole. For over 1,000 years, it did just that. It hid the world of the Moche. Flourishing from roughly 100 to 700 AD, the Moche were not a unified empire in the way we think of the Romans or the Inca. They were a collection of independent city-states scattered along the river valleys that cut through the desert, all sharing a common, vibrant, and deeply unsettling culture. They were a people who left no written language, no grand histories carved in stone. Instead, they spoke through their art. And for a long time, that was all we knew of them. The Moche were ceramic masters, arguably the finest of the ancient Americas. Their pottery, looted from graves for centuries and now filling museums worldwide, is a window into their lives. It depicts everything from detailed portraits of individuals to scenes of hunting, weaving, and farming. These vessels, known as huacos, show a society teeming with life. There are warriors with elaborate helmets, fishermen casting their nets, and women nursing their children. There are also depictions of their rich mythology, featuring supernatural beings, animal-headed gods, and epic struggles between the forces of order and chaos. For decades, archaeologists and art historians viewed these as just that, mythology. They saw the scenes of combat, of bound prisoners, and of decapitation as symbolic representations, allegories of the cosmic struggle. The art was too fine, the society too advanced for such things to be literal. The Moche were seen as a sophisticated, albeit mysterious, coastal people who built impressive adobe pyramids, called huacas, and then, for reasons unknown, simply faded away. But the desert does not keep its secrets forever. In the late 20th century, a new generation of archaeologists began to look beyond the beautiful pottery. They began to excavate the great huacas not as treasure hunters, but as forensic investigators. And what they found, particularly at a site near modern-day Trujillo called the Huacas de Moche, forced a complete and horrifying reevaluation of this entire culture. At the foot of a massive, eroded pyramid known as the Huaca de la Luna, the Temple of the Moon, the sand began to give up its dead. But these were not honored burials. They were the remains of dozens of men, their bones jumbled and broken, splayed across a plaza floor that had once been slick with their blood. This was no myth. This was a slaughterhouse. Forensic analysis of the skeletons told a chillingly precise story. These were not Moche locals. Isotopic analysis of their teeth, which carries a chemical signature of the water one drinks in childhood, revealed they were from the surrounding highlands and distant valleys. They were outsiders, foreigners. These were the losers of wars, the captives brought back to the Moche heartland not for slavery, but for a very specific, gruesome purpose. They were not simply killed. The evidence on their bones showed they had been systematically tortured and dismembered. Many had their fingers and toes broken. Others had their arms shattered. All of them met their end in the same way: a powerful blow to the head with a mace, followed by their throat being expertly slit. The story on the pottery was real. Archaeologists could now match the scenes on the ceramics to the evidence in the ground. They could trace the entire terrible sequence. First came the ritual combat. Moche art depicts warriors, clad in ornate regalia, fighting one-on-one. The goal was not to kill the opponent, but to dominate them, to knock off their helmet and capture them alive. The loser was stripped of his armor and weapons, a mark of ultimate humiliation. These captured warriors were then paraded back to the huacas, where they were held, perhaps for days or weeks, awaiting their fate. The final ceremony was a piece of high theater presided over by the Moche elite, the warrior priests. The victims were brought to the plaza, a natural amphitheater where hundreds could watch. There, before the assembled crowd, their lives were ended. But even death was not the end of their ordeal. The blood, the most precious substance in the Moche cosmos, was carefully collected in goblets. The art shows these goblets being presented to the main deity, a fanged, grimacing figure known to archaeologists as Apayek, the decapitator. The warrior priests, perhaps even the ruler himself, would then drink the blood of their enemies in a powerful act of consumption and dominance. Some of the bodies were left to be picked apart by vultures, which are also frequently depicted in Moche art at these scenes. Others were dismembered. Skulls were carefully defleshed and turned into trophies, sometimes worn on belts, other times converted into gruesome drinking mugs. The Moche were not just killing their enemies, they were consuming them, body and soul, in a ritual designed to absorb their power. At the Huaca de la Luna alone, the remains of more than 70 individuals have been found in this sacrificial context. And this was not a one-time event. The plaza was built and rebuilt multiple times, and with each new layer of construction, a new layer of bodies was added. This was a regular, integral part of Moche society for centuries, a state-sponsored spectacle of terror. Why would a society so artistically and technologically advanced engage in such systematic brutality? The answer seems to lie in the harsh environment they called home. The Moche were brilliant engineers, building vast networks of canals to irrigate the desert and turn it green. But their existence was precarious, entirely dependent on the whims of a volatile climate system. This region is the epicenter of the El Niño phenomenon, a periodic warming of the Pacific Ocean that can cause catastrophic weather. In some years, it brings torrential, destructive rains that would have washed away the Moche's adobe pyramids and destroyed their canal systems. In other years, it brings devastating drought, withering their crops in the fields. To the Moche, these were not random weather events. They were signs of cosmic imbalance, of angry gods who needed to be appeased. The sacrifices, then, were not acts of simple cruelty, but desperate transactions. They were offerings of the most potent thing they had, human lifeblood, to convince the supernatural world to restore order. The captured warriors were not just enemies, they were messengers to the gods. But there was another, more worldly purpose. The Moche world was politically fragmented. The various city-states were in constant competition for resources, for water, for land, for power. The ritual sacrifices were a powerful form of political propaganda. They were a terrifying demonstration of the might of a city's ruler and his patron deity. Imagine being a leader from a neighboring valley, invited to witness such a ceremony. You would see the power of your rival, not just in the size of his pyramid, but in the number of captives he could afford to kill. You would see the blood of your own countrymen being drunk by his priests. It was a message of domination, a way to maintain social control and intimidate rivals without constant open warfare. Fear was a tool of statecraft. The art, once seen as mythological, was now understood as a state-sponsored visual language, a constant reminder to everyone, from the lowest farmer to the highest noble, of the power of the elite and the bloody consequences of defiance. The grimacing face of Aya Apek was everywhere, a symbol of the violent order that underpinned their entire world. Yet for all their power and all their sacrifices, the Moche could not hold back the forces of nature. Around 600 AD, archaeological evidence points to a massive El Niño event, a mega El Niño that lasted for decades. It brought a period of intense flooding, followed by an equally long and punishing drought. The foundations of Moche society began to crumble. Their gods, who had been fed so much blood, seemed to have abandoned them. The sacrifices, which were meant to ensure stability, had failed. The faith of the people in their warrior priest rulers likely evaporated. Internal conflict erupted, and the Moche city-states turned on one another. By 800 AD, their unique culture had collapsed, and their great pyramids were abandoned to the encroaching desert sands. They left no books, no epic poems. All that remained was their beautiful, terrible art and the bones of their victims, a silent testament to a civilization built on a covenant of blood. The Moche were forgotten, their sinister past buried so completely that for centuries the world saw only the genius of their pottery, not the horror it depicted. They were a stark reminder that the greatest art can sometimes be born from the greatest darkness. As the Moche civilization disintegrated under the weight of climate change and internal strife, a power vacuum emerged in the coastal deserts of Peru. The world does not tolerate a vacuum for long. Out of the remnants of the Moche and other local cultures, a new, more centralized power began to rise. They were the Chimu, and they would go on to build the largest empire in the region before the coming of the Inca. Around 900 AD, the Chimu began to consolidate their control, establishing their capital at a sprawling adobe metropolis that would become known as Chan Chan. This was a city unlike any other in the Americas. At its peak, it covered over 20 square kilometers and was home to an estimated 30,000 people. It was a labyrinth of high walls, courtyards, temples, and palaces, all built from sun-dried mud brick. The Chimu were master organizers and engineers, even more so than their Moche predecessors. They repaired and expanded the ancient canal systems, creating a vast agricultural surplus that fueled their empire's growth. They were also incredible artisans, known for their distinctive blackware pottery and exquisite metalwork. For a long time, the story of the Chimu was the story of Chan Chan, a tale of imperial administration, urban planning, and artistic production. Their art was different from that of the Moche. It was more stylized, more focused on mass production. The graphic scenes of ritual combat and decapitation that were so central to Moche pottery were largely absent. This led early researchers to believe that the Chimu were perhaps a less violent, more bureaucratic society, one that had moved beyond the gruesome public spectacles of their ancestors. This assumption, like so many in the study of the ancient world, would prove to be catastrophically wrong. The Chimu did not abandon ritual sacrifice. They refined it, they scaled it up, and they directed it towards a new, even more disturbing target. The first hints of this hidden darkness came not from the grand palaces of Chan Chan, but from a desolate, windswept bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. In 2011, a team of archaeologists led by Gabriel Prieto was excavating a site near a local shantytown. The site was called Huanchiquito Las Llamas. They were initially investigating a small, 3,500-year-old temple. But as they worked, local residents told them about bones that were eroding out of a nearby dune. What they found there would rewrite the history of human sacrifice. At first, they uncovered a few skeletons, then a dozen, then dozens more. A dreadful pattern began to emerge. The skeletons were small. They were the remains of children. They were buried in a specific, methodical way, often wrapped in simple cotton shrouds. Alongside them were the skeletons of another type of juvenile, young llamas, all less than 18 months old. The excavation expanded, and the numbers grew at a terrifying rate. The final count for this single location was staggering. The remains of more than 140 children, aged between 5 and 14, and over 200 young llamas. It was, and still is, the largest single discovery of a mass child sacrifice event in the archaeological record, anywhere in the world. Forensic analysis of the small skeletons revealed the methodical nature of the killing. Each child, boy and girl alike, had a horizontal cut across their sternum. Their ribs had been pried apart. The evidence strongly suggests that their hearts had been removed. This was not a frenzied massacre. It was a calculated, ritualistic procedure, performed with a terrifying uniformity. Many of the children's faces had been smeared with a red pigment, likely as part of the ceremony. They were buried facing the sea, towards the setting sun in the west. The llamas were buried facing the Andes Mountains to the east. This careful positioning suggests a complex cosmology, a ritual designed to address the entire world, the ocean that brought the rain, and the mountains that were the source of the rivers. What could possibly drive a society to commit such an atrocity? The archaeological context provided a crucial clue. The layer of mud in which the children were buried was a flood deposit. This was evidence of a massive rainfall event, a clear sign of a powerful El Niño. Just like the Moche before them, the Chimu were at the mercy of this climatic beast. When their sophisticated irrigation canals failed, when their crops withered from drought or were washed away by floods, they turned to their gods. But their offering had changed. Perhaps they believed that the blood of captured warriors was no longer a powerful enough currency. To avert a catastrophe that threatened their very existence, they needed to make the ultimate sacrifice, the most precious offering imaginable, their own children. Children were seen as pure, uncorrupted beings, intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. Their sacrifice was the most powerful plea for mercy that Chimu could conceive of. The llamas, a primary source of wealth and sustenance, were likely intended as companions and guides for the children on their journey to the afterlife, ensuring their message reached the gods. The discovery at Huanchaquito Las Llamas was a shock to the archaeological community. It revealed a hidden, horrifying dimension to the Chimu Empire. But the story was far from over. It was about to get even worse. A few years later, just a short distance away at a site called Pampa La Cruz, Prieto's team began to find more and more. At Pampa La Cruz, they unearthed another mass grave of sacrificed children, then another, and another. The excavations are ongoing, but the numbers have already eclipsed the first discovery. The total number of sacrificed children found in this small area has now surpassed 300. This was not a single desperate act. It was a state policy. Radiocarbon dating of the remains shows that these sacrifices took place in at least 6 distinct events, spanning a period of over 400 years, from around 1050 to 1500 AD. This was an established tradition, a terrible tool in the Chimu state's religious and political toolkit, to be deployed whenever they faced a major climactic crisis. The sheer scale is difficult to comprehend. This was not a hidden cult operating on the fringes of society. An operation of this magnitude, involving hundreds of children and animals, performed by skilled ritual specialists, and followed by a mass burial, would have required the direct involvement and sanction of the Chimu state, right from the ruler in Chan Chan. It was a public and organized response to disaster. One of the most haunting questions is, where did the children come from? Were they the children of the elite, offered up to show the people that everyone was making a sacrifice? Or were they taken from conquered territories, a form of tribute paid in human lives? The answer is still being sought through DNA and isotopic analysis, but either possibility paints a grim picture of life in the Chimu Empire. Think of the societal mechanisms required to carry out such an act. The selection of the children, their preparation for the ceremony, the priests who had to carry out the killings again and again, the parents who had to surrender their sons and daughters. It points to a belief system so powerful and a fear so profound that it could override the most basic human instinct to protect one's young. This was a society that, for all its administrative genius and artistic skill, was held hostage by its gods and its climate. The magnificent mud brick walls of Chan Chan were not just designed to keep invaders out. They enclosed a society that, when pushed to the brink, would turn on its own children in a desperate bid for survival. The sinister past of the Chimu was not just violence, but the cold, calculated, and repeated sacrifice of innocence. In 1470 AD, the Chimu Empire was finally conquered by the rapidly expanding Inca. The Inca were no strangers to human sacrifice themselves, famously practicing a form of child sacrifice known as kapak hucha. But even they may have been taken aback by the sheer scale of the Chimu rituals. It's possible the Inca suppressed the practice, replacing it with their own, less frequent, but no less tragic ceremonies. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived a half-century later, the great city of Chan Chan was already in decline, and the darkest secrets of the Chimu were being buried by the same sands that had claimed the Moche. It took 500 years for the truth to be unearthed, a truth written not in texts, but in the small, broken bones of hundreds of children. a silent chorus testifying to the terrifying faith of a lost empire. We now leave the sun-scorched deserts of South America and travel across the Atlantic to a very different world. A world of dense, primeval forests, mist-covered hills, and rain-soaked peat bogs. This is the Europe of the Iron Age, a continent before the legions of Rome marched forth to impose their will upon it. This was the world of the Celts. The word Celt itself is a problematic one. It is a broad label applied by ancient Greek and Roman writers to a vast and diverse array of tribal peoples who stretched from Ireland to Turkey. They were not a single, unified empire, but a patchwork of chiefdoms and kingdoms, linked by shared traditions in art, language, and warfare. And it is in warfare and religion that their sinister side becomes most apparent. Our modern perception of the Celts is often hopelessly romanticized. We think of noble warriors fighting for their freedom, of mystical druids communing with nature, of a lost, magical past. But the reality, pieced together from the biased accounts of their enemies and the grim discoveries of archaeology, is far darker and more brutal. This was a world steeped in violence, fear, and a religion that demanded blood. Much of what we know, or think we know, comes from Roman writers like Julius Caesar and the Greek geographer Strabo. These men were not impartial observers. Caesar, in particular, was engaged in a brutal war of conquest against the Celtic tribes of Gaul, modern-day France, and his writings were a form of propaganda designed to justify his actions to the Senate back in Rome. He portrayed the Gauls as savage barbarians in need of Roman civilization. He may have exaggerated, but archaeology has increasingly shown that there was a kernel of terrifying truth in his accounts. One of the most pervasive and well-documented Celtic practices was the cult of the severed head. To the Celtic warrior, the head was not just a part of the body. It was the seat of the soul, the essence of a person's identity and power. To take an enemy's head in battle was the ultimate victory. It was to capture his spirit, to absorb his strength. After a battle, Celtic warriors would decapitate their most formidable foes, tie the heads to their saddles, and ride home in triumph. These were not just grisly souvenirs, they were trophies of immense spiritual and social significance. Strabo writes that the heads of distinguished enemies were embalmed in cedar oil and proudly displayed in chests for visitors to admire. They would refuse to sell these trophies even for their weight in gold. This was not a fringe practice, it was central to the Celtic warrior ethos. Archaeological sites in southern France, like Roquepertos and Entremont, have revealed stone porticos with niches carved into them, perfectly sized to hold a human skull. These were public displays of power, monuments built from the heads of their enemies. This obsession with the head permeates Celtic art. We see it in stone carvings, in intricate metalwork. The head is often depicted alone, a powerful, disembodied symbol. This was a culture that revered the head as the source of life, and therefore saw its ritual collection as a way of controlling the spiritual world. But their rituals went far beyond collecting the heads of their enemies. Roman accounts speak of large-scale human sacrifice orchestrated by the priestly class known as the Druids. The Druids were more than just priests. They were the judges, scholars, and political advisors of Celtic society. They held immense power, a power rooted in their role as intermediaries with the gods. And their gods, it seems, had a voracious appetite. Caesar describes different gods demanding different forms of sacrifice. Victims destined for the god Teutites were said to be drowned in a vat. Those for Essus were hung from trees and ritually wounded. But the most infamous account, the one that has haunted the European imagination for 2 millennia, is the sacrifice to the god Tyrannus. This is the tale of the Wicker Man. According to Caesar, the Druids would construct a colossal effigy woven from wicker or branches in the shape of a man. They would then fill this structure with living people, typically criminals, but if the supply ran short, innocent victims would suffice. The entire effigy, with its screaming human cargo, was then set ablaze, a massive human torch offered up to the god of thunder. For centuries, this story was dismissed by many historians as pure Roman propaganda, a tale too monstrous to be true, designed to paint the Druids as evil fanatics. There is no direct archaeological evidence for the Wicker Man itself. Such a structure would not survive. But other discoveries have lent a chilling credibility to the Roman accounts of ritual violence. The most compelling and visceral evidence comes from the peat bogs of northern Europe. These bogs create a unique anaerobic environment, which can preserve organic material, including human bodies, in astonishing detail. Over the centuries, hundreds of these bog bodies have been discovered. Men and women from the Iron Age who met violent ends before being deposited in the watery pools. One of the most famous is the Lindo Man, discovered in a bog in Cheshire, England in 1984. He lived around 2,000 years ago, and his death was anything but peaceful. Forensic analysis revealed he was the victim of a ritualistic triple death. He was first struck on the head with a heavy object hard enough to shatter his skull. He was then garroted with a sinew cord which was twisted so tightly it broke his neck. Finally, his throat was cut. This was not a simple murder. This was a ceremony. The sheer overkill, the combination of 3 different methods of killing, strongly suggests a ritual purpose. The man's last meal, preserved in his stomach, consisted of a simple griddle cake, indicating he was not a high-status individual. He was likely a chosen victim, an offering to 3 different gods at once, or a sacrifice to ensure the fertility of the land. Another bog body, the Toland Man from Denmark, was so well preserved that when he was discovered in 1950, the police initially thought he was a recent murder victim. He had been hanged, the leather noose still tight around his neck. His face was serene, his eyes closed as if in sleep. He, too, was a sacrifice, sent to the gods in the liminal space of the bog, a place the Celts saw as a gateway to the other world. These bodies are the silent witnesses, the irrefutable proof that the Roman stories were not pure fantasy. They confirm that ritual killing was a part of the Celtic world. The questions that remain are of scale and frequency. Was it a rare occurrence, reserved for times of great crisis? Or was it a more regular feature of their religious life? Some ancient sources even hint at a darker practice still, ritual cannibalism. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that the Celts would sometimes eat their enemies, believing it would allow them to absorb their courage. Archaeological evidence for this is highly contentious. Marks on human bones found at some sites could be interpreted as signs of butchery, but they could also be the result of complex burial rites. The line is thin and the evidence is ambiguous, leaving a disturbing question mark hanging over the Celtic world. What is clear is that the pre-Roman Celtic world was one governed by a different set of rules, a different understanding of life, death, and the sacred. It was a world where a warrior's status was measured by the heads on his belt, where the gods demanded payment in human lives, and where the Druids held the power of life and death. This was the world that Rome set out to conquer. And conquer it they did. The Roman legions systematically dismantled the Celtic tribal structures. The Druids were seen as a major source of resistance and were brutally suppressed. The sacred groves were cut down. The old gods were either replaced or absorbed into the Roman pantheon, and the practices of headhunting and human sacrifice were stamped out. A new order was imposed. Later, the arrival of Christianity would deliver the final blow, erasing the last vestiges of the old pagan beliefs. The sinister past of the Celts was buried, demonized, and largely forgotten, replaced by the sanitized legends of King Arthur and the mystical tales of Ireland. It is only through the biased words of their conquerors and the preserved bodies in the box that we can catch a glimpse of the brutal, terrifying, and complex reality of this lost European civilization. Our journey now takes us to a place far removed from both the Americas and Europe, to the savanna woodlands of West Africa. Here, in what is now northern and central Nigeria, a culture emerged that is one of the most mysterious and significant in African history. We know them as the Nok, and they flourished for over a millennium, from around 1000 BC to 300 AD. The Nok are a ghost civilization. They left behind no great stone monuments, no written records, no epic histories of their kings and queens. The acidic soil of the region has consumed almost everything they left behind. Their homes, their tools, their clothes, and even their bones have dissolved into the earth, leaving virtually no trace. They would have remained completely unknown to history, another culture swallowed by time, were it not for one extraordinary legacy: their art. The Nok were prolific and breathtakingly skilled sculptors, creating life-sized and miniature terracotta figures of stunning sophistication. And it is through this art alone that we must try to understand their world. And that art, for all its beauty, contains unsettling hints of a sinister past. The discovery of the Nok culture was a complete accident. In 1943, a British archaeologist named Bernard Fagg was shown a small terracotta head that was being used as a scarecrow in a yam field. He recognized it as something unique and important. He learned that similar figures were frequently being unearthed by local workers during tin mining operations in the region around the village of Nok. Fagg began to collect and study these sculptures, and slowly the picture of a lost civilization began to emerge. Radiocarbon dating revealed their astonishing age. The Nok were creating this complex art centuries before the rise of the great West African empires like Ghana and Mali. They were also pioneers of technology, representing one of the earliest societies in sub-Saharan Africa to smelt iron. This combination of sophisticated art and advanced metallurgy points to a well-organized, complex society. They were not simple hunter-gatherers. They must have had a settled agricultural base, capable of supporting a class of specialized artisans and blacksmiths. They had a rich ceremonial life and a complex belief system. But the details of that system remain almost entirely hidden from us. This is where the mystery deepens and the investigation turns towards the sinister. With no text to guide us and no skeletons to study for signs of trauma or ritual, we are forced to become art critics, to search for clues in the silent clay faces that stare back at us across 2,000 years. And the clues are profoundly enigmatic. The Nok sculptures are stylistically unique. They typically depict human heads or figures with large, triangular or semicircular eyes, parted lips, and elaborate, detailed hairstyles or headdressers. Their expressions are often calm, almost serene. But some figures deviate from this pattern in disturbing ways. Certain sculptures appear to depict individuals suffering from physical ailments. There are figures with contorted limbs or faces that show signs of paralysis or disease. What was the purpose of these sculptures? Were they medical models? Were they portraits of revered individuals who had overcome these afflictions? Or do they represent something darker? Some scholars have speculated that these figures were used in ritual contexts related to disease and healing. In a world without modern medicine, disease would have been a terrifying and mysterious force, often attributed to witchcraft or the displeasure of the gods. It is possible that these sculptures were effigies of the sick, used in ceremonies designed to transfer the illness from the person to the clay figure. Such rituals could have had a dark side, perhaps involving sacrifice, animal or even human, to complete the magical transaction. Other unsettling details emerge on closer inspection. Some female figures are depicted with what appear to be scar ornaments on their breasts, deliberate patterns of scarification. While scarification has been a common practice in many African cultures, its depiction in such ancient art raises questions about the rituals it was associated with. Was it a mark of status or a form of ritual self-mutilation performed during religious ceremonies? The purpose of the terracotta heads themselves is the central enigma. Most of the figures are known only from their heads. Complete bodies are rare. This suggests that the heads may have been the most important part. Were they part of full-body sculptures that were ritually broken, with only the head being preserved? Or were they created as heads from the beginning, perhaps to be placed on wooden or fiber bodies for use in ceremonies? One theory is that they were part of funerary rituals, created as portraits of the deceased to serve as a home for their spirit after death. If so, what did these funerals entail? Another theory suggests they were part of ancestor worship, powerful objects that allowed the living to communicate with the dead. Such practices, in many cultures, can involve offerings and sacrifices to appease the ancestral spirits. We are left with a series of unsettling questions. Why the emphasis on the head? Why the depiction of disease? What was the meaning of the elaborate hairstyles and jewelry? Each sculpture is a clue, but a clue in a language we have lost the ability to read. The silence of the Nuk is what makes them so unnerving. We can see the evidence of their complexity, but we cannot grasp their worldview. This void of knowledge has been made worse by the modern world. Since the 1980s, Nok sites have been subjected to massive and systematic looting. The international art market's demand for these beautiful and ancient sculptures has led to the destruction of countless archaeological sites. Figures are ripped from the ground by looters with no regard for their context, breaking the first rule of archaeology. Every time a sculpture is illegally excavated, it is not just an artifact that is stolen. It is a piece of the puzzle, a page torn from the only book we have about the Nok. We lose the ability to know where it was found, what it was found with, and how it was positioned. The sinister past of the Nok is not just what they might have done, but the fact that their story is being actively erased before we have had a chance to decipher it. And then there is the final mystery, their disappearance. Around 300 AD, after more than 1,000 years of continuous cultural production, the Nok simply vanish from the archaeological record. The creation of terracotta sculptures ceases. There is no evidence of a violent conquest, no sign of a gradual decline. They are just gone. What could have caused such a complete and sudden collapse? Was it a devastating epidemic, a plausible theory given the sculptures depicting disease? Was it a period of dramatic climate change that destroyed their agricultural base? Or was it some form of internal social or religious upheaval that tore their society apart from within? We simply do not know. The Nok culture stands as a profound historical mystery. They were one of Africa's earliest complex societies, a people of immense artistic talent and technological innovation. But their inner world, their beliefs, their fears, and the reasons for their ultimate demise remain locked away. The terracotta figures are their only legacy, a silent army of ghosts from a lost kingdom, their enigmatic expressions guarding the secrets of a potentially dark and sinister past. For our final chapter, we travel to a civilization that is anything but forgotten. Its name is synonymous with lost empires and ancient mysteries, the Aztecs. They are infamous for one thing above all else: human sacrifice on a terrifying scale. The image of a priest atop a towering pyramid, holding a still-beating heart to the sun, is deeply ingrained in the popular imagination. But the very familiarity of this horror can be misleading. It allows us to compartmentalize the Aztecs, to see their practice of sacrifice as a singular, bizarre religious obsession within an otherwise advanced society. This is a profound misunderstanding. The sinister past of the Aztecs was not confined to the sacrificial altar. It was a pervasive and systematic culture of cruelty that permeated every aspect of their lives, from their religion and warfare to their legal system and even the raising of their children. To understand the Aztecs, we must first understand their cosmos.
They believed they were living in the age of the fifth sun, a world that was fragile and destined for a violent end, just as the four suns before it had been destroyed. Their primary duty was to keep this fifth sun alive. And the sun, their chief deity Huitzilopochtli, did not feed on prayer or faith. It fed on human blood. Without a constant supply of precious water, as they called it, the sun would weaken, the darkness would triumph, and the universe would collapse into chaos. Human sacrifice was therefore not just a religious rite, it was a cosmic necessity, the most important work a human being could perform. This belief drove their empire to become an efficient and relentless machine for acquiring sacrificial victims. And while heart extraction was the most common method, it was far from the only one. The Aztecs had a diverse and gruesome menu of sacrificial offerings tailored to the specific god they wished to appease. Victims destined for Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility, were often children, whose tears were believed to entice the rain. They were taken to sacred mountains and drowned. Those offered to Huehueteotl, the old fire god, were drugged and then thrown into a great bonfire. Before they could die from the flames, they were pulled out with hooks and their hearts were extracted. Perhaps the most terrifying fate was reserved for those sacrificed to Xipe Totec, our Lord the Flayed One, a god of agriculture and renewal. The victim was killed, and then a priest would carefully flay their entire skin in one piece, which he would then wear for 20 days as a symbol of rebirth. This was not a rare occurrence. The dedication of the Great Temple of Tenochtitlan in 1487 was, according to Aztec accounts, celebrated with the sacrifice of thousands of victims over 4 days. While the exact numbers are debated by historians and may have been exaggerated by both the Aztecs themselves to intimidate their enemies and the later Spanish to justify their conquest, the archaeological evidence has confirmed a scale of killing that is hard to fathom. In 2015, archaeologists in Mexico City discovered the Huitzilopochtli, the great skull rack of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan. The Spanish conquistadors had described it as a terrifying structure holding tens of thousands of skulls. The discovery proved they were not lying. The rack was a massive platform, and archaeologists have unearthed thousands of skulls, with many more likely still buried. Chillingly, the analysis showed that the victims were not just enemy warriors, but also women and children, challenging the long-held belief that only men were sacrificed in this manner. This relentless need for victims fundamentally shaped Aztec warfare. While they did fight wars for conquest and tribute, they also practiced a unique form of ritualized conflict known as the Xochitl, or Flower War. These were prearranged battles between the Aztecs and their rivals, where the primary objective was not to kill the enemy on the battlefield or to gain territory, but to capture them alive for later sacrifice. War was a sacred duty, a way of harvesting food for the gods. After the sacrifice, the body of the victim was sometimes dismembered. The limbs might be given to the warrior who captured him, who would then take them home to be cooked in a stew with maize, to be shared in a solemn, ritual feast. This was not cannibalism for hunger's sake. It was a form of sacred communion, a way of partaking in the divine energy of the sacrifice. The line between holy and horrific was non-existent, but the Aztec culture of cruelty extended far beyond the temple precinct. It was woven into the very fabric of their legal and social systems, a tool for maintaining absolute order through fear. The Aztec system of justice was swift, impartial, and breathtakingly harsh. Punishments were not carried out in private, but were public spectacles designed to terrorize the populace into obedience. Even minor crimes received brutal punishments. A common thief might be stoned to death in the marketplace where he committed the crime. Slander was punished by having one's lips cut off. Adultery was a capital offense, typically carried out by strangulation or stoning. The law was particularly severe when it came to public order. For a young person, public drunkenness was punishable by death. Their head would be bashed in. This harshness began in childhood. The Aztecs believed in strict discipline to create hardy, obedient citizens. An Aztec legal document, the Codex Mendoza, illustrates the prescribed punishments for children. A disobedient 10-year-old would be beaten with sticks. An 11-year-old could be punished by being held over a fire of burning chili peppers, forced to inhale the acrid, painful smoke. These were not considered abuse, but necessary steps in a child's education.
This entire system, the cosmic duty to feed the gods, the ritualized warfare, the cannibalistic feasts, and the draconian legal code, created a society where life was cheap and death was ever present. It was a culture held together by a shared belief in a fragile universe and a shared fear of the brutal consequences of stepping out of line, whether against the gods or against the state.
When the Spanish conquistadors under Hernán Cortés arrived in 1519, they were both awestruck by the sophistication of Tenochtitlan, a magnificent city on a lake, larger and cleaner than many in Europe, and utterly horrified by the evidence of sacrifice they saw everywhere. The blood-caked temples, the stench of death, and the sight of the Zompatli were, to them, proof that this was a satanic empire in need of destruction.
Of course, the Spanish were themselves capable of extreme cruelty, and their conquest was a brutal affair of greed and violence. But they used the Aztecs' own sinister practices as the ultimate justification for their actions. They tore down the temples, smashed the idols, and suppressed the religion, burying the Aztec world under the foundations of what would become Mexico City. The Aztecs were not a simple or primitive people. They were brilliant astronomers, gifted poets, and skilled engineers. But their civilization was built upon a worldview that is, to us, profoundly alien and deeply disturbing. They show us that societal complexity is no guarantee against institutionalized cruelty. Their sinister past serves as a powerful and unsettling reminder that a civilization can reach for the stars with one hand while holding a bloody obsidian knife in the other. We have journeyed through the shadows of 5 distinct worlds, each separated by vast oceans and immense spans of time. We have stood in the Moche's sacrificial plaza, a stage for the ritualized consumption of their enemy's power. We have witnessed the chilling, methodical sacrifice of hundreds of Chimu children, an offering made in desperation to the unpitying sea and sky. We have walked through the misty forests of Celtic Europe, a land where the human head was the ultimate prize, and the bogs became the final resting place for victims of a dark faith. We have peered into the void left by the Knock, a culture whose haunting art is the only clue to a world we can no longer comprehend. And we have descended into the Aztec universe, a society where cosmic terror demanded a constant river of blood. On the surface, these cultures could not be more different. Their art, their languages, their environments, their gods, all are unique. Yet, a common, dark thread runs through them all. It is the use of systematic, ritualized violence as a fundamental tool for ordering their world. It was not chaos or madness, it was a calculated and essential part of their societies. For some, like the Moche and Chimu, it was a desperate transaction with a hostile environment, a way to bargain with unpredictable and destructive natural forces. For the Celts, it was intertwined with the ethos of the warrior and the power of the priestly class. For the Aztecs, it was a cosmic imperative, the engine that kept their universe from collapsing. For the Knock, the silence of the evidence is its own kind of terror, a hint of practices we can only guess at. These stories challenge our comfortable notions of progress. They reveal that the capacity for breathtaking artistic creation and sophisticated social organization can exist alongside practices of unimaginable cruelty. They show that civilization is not a vaccine against barbarism. Sometimes it is merely a more organized and efficient way of implementing it. These are the stories that history tried to forget,
They were buried by conquerors, by new religions, and by the simple, relentless passage of time. They do not fit neatly into our grand narrative of human advancement. They are a dark mirror, reflecting a part of the human experience we would rather not acknowledge. Our ancient and enduring relationship with fear, with faith, and with violence. But the work of the archaeologist is to remember. It is to dig past the comfortable stories and confront the difficult truths. And that work is far from over. All over the world, beneath our cities and our fields, other forgotten civilizations lie waiting. Other silenced voices are ready to speak. What other sinister secrets are still buried, waiting for the patient scrape of a trowel to bring them into the light? The past is never truly dead. It is not even past. It is a vast, dark landscape, and we have only just begun to explore its deepest, most unsettling corners. The echoes of these lost worlds are a reminder that the history we know is only a fraction of the truth, and the darkest chapters are often the ones yet to be read.